You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. After about 4 years of doing this program, or should I say just a little over 4 years, I begin to see that there's a wonderful, majestic feeling that brings out of the program where people get to a point in their lives and wonder, is there anything truly left to do? Many people seem to think about things such as, well, I feel like I'm going through a crisis. I don't know what I'm going to do with myself. So what we try to do here on the Beyond 50 radio program is bring you some really nice, exciting things to at least consider and the people that are actually doing them. Joining us on the program today is someone who has done just that. Alone in a fisherman's skiff, she decided to row down the Nile. And joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is our guest, Rosemary Mahoney. And Rosemary, thank you for joining us on the program today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what was it about the Nile that you decided this was a journey for you?
Well, I had been rowing for quite a while. I grew up in New England, always very close to the ocean, and I row regularly, just about every day. And I happened to go to Egypt to visit a friend who was living there, and when I saw the Nile, I thought, this is the perfect body of water for rowing. It's wide, it's calm, there aren't any rapids, and the weather is always good, and the landscape is just beautiful. And so I got this. I had actually gone up the Nile on a cruise boat. I did that twice, and that is ordinarily the only way a foreigner could really do this. And while that was exciting and it was quite beautiful and we saw amazing things, I had a great desire to be on the Nile by myself in my own boat. And so it took me about 2 years. I did a lot of research, and I finally came to the point where I was able to go to Egypt and try to buy a rowboat. And I should say probably the most difficult thing about this trip was actually persuading someone to sell me a rowboat. First of all, I was a woman, and you very rarely see women alone in boats on the Nile. Second, I was a foreigner.
Right, that was one of the things that really intrigued me about this, is the fact that you were a woman, and you were in this area doing something that men would kind of, what, is she off of her rocker or what?
Right. Well,
what part of the world do you think you're in here?
Yeah, even a foreign man would probably have difficulty doing this. And in fact, I think officially it's really illegal for foreigners to operate their own boats on the Nile, but that's a little bit of a formality. You never see women in boats alone on the Nile. You never see Egyptian women alone in a boat. And so the Egyptian, I would go up and down the Nile in Aswan asking fishermen, do you want to sell me your boat? And they simply couldn't understand it. And for about 2 weeks, I had no success. A lot of them offered to row me. I mean, you can hire an Egyptian fisherman or a sailing captain to take you for a few days on the Nile, but I wanted to do it by myself. And finally, I found a guy who understood that I wanted to do something different. But the interesting thing was, I knew that if I went down the Nile alone, looking the way I looked, I wouldn't get very far. Not because the police or the Egyptian authorities would stop me, but because Egyptians are so incredibly friendly and curious. And it would be such a strange thing. I knew that after a couple of hours, I would have 100 people following me. So I went a bit in disguise. I dressed kind of like what an Egyptian man would dress in, and I wrapped my head in a cloth, and I managed to stay in the middle of the river, away from the banks, and nobody noticed me.
Oh.
So I was a bit incognito. But people have said to me, didn't you think this might be something dangerous to do? Egypt is a Muslim country. You're a Western woman. There's already inherent difficulties in that. And the fact of the matter is that in Egypt, in particular, in the Middle East, foreigners are treated exceptionally well because Egypt is very dependent on tourism. For it's one of the main sources of income in Egypt. And when you hear news of tourists, being bombed by terrorists in Egypt, that really damages the Egyptian economy. And so, since that's happened a couple of times, the Egyptian government is very careful to protect foreigners. So I knew that, it would be a very daring Egyptian man who would actually touch a foreign woman. Literally, they wouldn't dare to touch you because the consequences of that could be really dire. Now, having said that, one of the interesting things about this effort to find my own boat was that I was quite harassed and followed by Egyptian men. And that's sort of a standard thing in Egypt. I think Egyptian men have a perception that foreign women are all loose and sex crazed, mainly because of the way we dress. We don't cover our bodies the way women do in the Middle East, and also, they know what particularly American culture is like, or European culture, and when they see cruise boats coming into the dock at Luxor, these cruise boats have swimming pools. And they're mainly Europeans on these boats who are lying around the swimming pool in bikinis.
Right.
And this is something that Egyptian men just don't ordinarily see unless it's foreigners dressed this way. In addition to that, there also is a strange new development in Egypt and also in other developing countries. And I don't know why I say it's strange, but it's something I had never heard of before. And that is that apparently foreign women are now going to places like Egypt on a kind of sex tourism. They go and they pay the younger men to have sex with them. And when I first heard this, I didn't believe it. But then I actually saw it in action. And this is something that's happening more and more now. And so it sort of compounds the impression that foreign women are loose and are really only looking for sex. Well, that wasn't my purpose there. And the number of conversations I had about sex with Egyptian men was just amazing.
Wow.
And this is one of the things I talk about in my book. But at the same time, I actually felt very safe there. I think it would be more dangerous for me to make a similar trip on a river like the Mississippi or the Hudson. I think I would be in far more personal danger. The rate of personal crime in the United States is much higher than it is in Egypt.
Now, describe why the men's attitude in Egypt, even though they have that outgoing feeling about sex, why it felt safer for you there. What was it about their inherent makeup? Was it just tradition, religion? What was it specifically?
Well, it was actually tradition, a tradition that sort of began after Napoleon invaded Egypt, when foreigners, for the first time since the Greeks and the Romans were there, were able to actually go to Egypt. Since that time, foreigners have been very well protected in Egypt and highly respected, and it is kind of an economic matter. For example, if an Egyptian man did something unseemly to me, and I went to the police and said, this man touched me in an inappropriate way, they would arrest him and put him in jail and beat him without having any evidence that the man actually did anything to me. The foreigner's word is always more important than the local person's word, and this again has to do with, foreign money. But in addition to that, the Egyptian, the Egyptian culture is very repressive about sex. I found it almost as repressive as, the Irish Catholic culture was in the 50s. It's very unusual for an Egyptian young man, to have any female friends, let alone a girlfriend. for the Egyptians, sex is something that should happen only within marriage. And so in some ways, the young Egyptian men are actually very naive about sex. And a lot of the conversations I had were conversations that were really rooted in a curiosity on the Egyptian man's part. And I actually found that very sad. I found a great loneliness among the young Egyptian men. So it was partly that, but they also told me, we feel that we can talk with you about certain things that we could never talk about with Egyptian women. I mean, just as a friendly conversation, a conversation in which I never felt threatened or that there was any aggression toward me. And that's something that I think we in the West aren't really aware of. Islam is quite repressive about sexuality. I mean, you see that obviously.
What I found interesting in your book on that is that you talk about, just to give folks an idea, is that in Egypt, at least according to what you were writing in your book, is that if a woman has lost her virginity, let's just say they've been in marriage and then there's the possibility of divorce, that she probably won't be remarried again just based on the fact that she's no longer a virgin. And I thought, wow, that really is rolling it back to the dark centuries, so to speak.
Yeah.
And then you're talking about the conversations where in the West, men and women tend to get that true opportunity to express their sexuality, their gender more than anything, to say, this is how I feel and I see things, and we have that open dialogue. But here it just seems really almost one-sided, if you will, but then there's really no side at all.
Yeah, exactly. I actually, more than once, I met an Egyptian man who told me that if he found out that his sister had sex before she was married, he would kill her. I mean, literally, he would take her life. And I tried to reason with them, and I said, well, that's, it's not logical, and it's not humane. You kill her, you go to jail, her life is over, and your life is over too. And the response was, nobody would blame me, because I am protecting my family's name. There's a great importance placed on honor, and a woman can shame her family in ways, almost more than any man in the family could.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, that you could talk about rowing the Nile, and then you get into a nice discussion about sexuality and attitudes in Egypt.
Well, yes, I went because I wanted to take this rowing trip, but the interest of the trip really was in the people that I met and the conversations that I had, and the way Egyptians perceived me. I talked with many Egyptian women as well, and without fail, they would say to me, you're so lucky. You're so free. For example, I saw you running yesterday along the Corniche, which is the boulevard along the Nile. And I said, well, and she said, we never run. It would be unseemly for us to run. But we'd like to run. We're supposed to stay in the house and really express no sort of personal desire about anything. And I mean, more than once, that Egyptian women said to me, I envy you because you're free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's just amazing to think that you go on this adventure and it brings you an insight that you probably weren't expecting at all.
Well, a trip like that does make you, it makes you both appreciate sort of what you've been given in your own country, and it also makes you look at certain things in your own country that are not necessarily so positive. I mean, again, the fact that the rate of personal crime in the United States is so much higher than it is in a place like Egypt, that says something about a certain mindset, I think. I would be very afraid to row down the Hudson by myself and sleep on the banks of the river alone as a woman, in a way that I wasn't afraid in Egypt.
Yeah, exactly. I can imagine, too, that as you're going down the Nile and you're beginning to really embrace and feel the culture, you feel this certain level of safety, as you were talking about, that you normally wouldn't even feel in your own United States.
Right.
And it's been really quite interesting over the many shows and conversations that I've had with people who have traveled abroad. One of the things that I've tried to consistently or wanted to bring up, especially after the attacks of 9/11, is what is it like to be in those other countries? Because the first thing you feel is that fear of another culture. You don't really understand it, and am I in any danger, so to speak? And one of the most unanimous things that keep coming back in our conversations is the same thing that you have said here today, is that you start looking back at the United States, even though we love it, but you feel safer outside of the United States than you would in it. And I was really surprised that I've heard that very consistently. Right.
In that particular sense, yes. It is true that there are fundamentalist Islamists who, terrorists really in Egypt, who would love to bomb a bus full of American tourists. And the reason they're not doing that so much as an attack on the West. They're doing it in order to damage the Egyptian government, which is not religious at the moment, and the Egyptian government is very West-leaning. And the fundamentalists in Egypt would like to see it as a religious state. So I don't want to just gloss over the fact that a group of foreigners in Egypt is at risk, in a sense, is still at risk. One person alone, and then this was one of the reasons I didn't feel I was in danger, terrorists don't really want to just kill one person. They want to make a sensation. I don't know if you remember, it was about 10 years ago, over 50 people were murdered by terrorists at the Temple of Hatshepsut in Luxor. Do you remember that?
That seems familiar. 10 years ago, yeah.
I think it was 57 people. There were Japanese tourists. I mean, a whole mix of tourists, and that was devastating for Egypt. Nobody wanted to go to Egypt after that. It isn't the individual they want to harm. They want publicity, and they actually want to keep tourists away because it makes the Egyptian government suffer. But just to say, we do in the West, in the United States and in Europe, we do have sort of a large and kind of vague fear of the Muslim world. And we know where that comes from. But what I found in Egypt was that the average Egyptian was really not very different from me. And the curiosity about America was enormous. Most of the people I talked to told me that their dream was to go to New York, and see the tall buildings and the yellow taxis. I didn't feel that there was hatred toward me as an American from the average Egyptian.
Mm-hmm. Which is the same consensus that I've gotten from other guests that we've had on our program, is simply that people, as you've said through the show, are very curious. They have a lot of questions. And you're the same way. You're just as curious about who they are. And was this one of the motivating factors for you to want to take this trip?
You mean my curiosity?
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I travel. I do mostly travel writing. This was my 5th book, and I lived in China for a while, and I've lived in a couple of foreign countries, and I've done some adventuresome things. It just seems to be in my nature, but actually the main motivation is that I'm very curious about foreign cultures. But interestingly, what I find when I travel is that people in foreign cultures end up seeming to be more like me than not like me. We are, after all human.
Right.
And that's the sort of heartening, uplifting thing you find when you travel. I found the Egyptians incredibly friendly and generous.
For those of you just tuning in, you're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program, and our guest today, Rosemary Mahoney, who decided to row down the Nile all alone in a fisherman's skiff. Now, when you say the word Nile, I would have to say it's probably the most recognizable river in the world. It's literally world history by itself. Now, what was that feeling like as you were rowing on the Nile? What things came to mind?
Well, that's a very good question. That, to me, was once I was actually on the river by myself, it was extremely exciting to me. I'd done a lot of reading about the history of Egypt and the history of the Nile. You know, the Nile is the longest river in the world. It's over 4,000 miles, and it actually travels up the African continent through 10 different countries. So I didn't row the whole Nile. I rowed a part of the Egyptian Nile. You know, I mean, that would be a real feat.
Yes, exactly.
But you know, particularly in Egypt, because it's probably the oldest culture along the Nile, you do get a kind of eerie sense. You can't help thinking about the millions of people who've been on that river before you.
Right.
You know, and you're rowing along, and you turn a bend, and there's a pharaonic temple in the distance. There's something very, very thrilling about that. You don't have to be in a rowboat to be thrilled by that either. If you take a cruise boat, you're constantly passing by these amazing ancient structures. I mean, in addition to the long history of the Nile, the history of foreign travelers on the Nile since Napoleon's invasion of Egypt is also very fascinating. In fact, in the book, I sort of followed the footsteps of Gustave Flaubert and Florence Nightingale, who were just two of the sort of notable people who traveled on the Nile for months. After the French invasion of Egypt, Egypt became the hot destination for travelers. Everybody wanted to go there. You know, they wanted to see the incredible antiquities that had been discovered, and it was just a very exotic place. And Europeans and Americans flocked there in droves in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. So that aspect of it, too, was very interesting to me.
You know, it just seems like such a wonderful adventure without being extreme, because we've had people, for instance, kayaking down the Sangpo River, people who want to whitewater the Colorado River, and there's all these extreme things. But, you know, even as I look at the cover of your book, Down the Nile, as I see a certain sense of peace and settling and really being in and one of the environment. And I'm sure that there were many, many, many moments of self-reflection that you must have truly enjoyed as you were on this trip. There
was also one very terrifying moment toward the end of my trip, but the fear was...
That's why the word adventure is in the book.
Yeah.
The
fear,
terrifying
actually,
moment.
I discovered the fear was all in my head. I don't want to give away the punchline, but it is something sort of amazing happened toward the end of the trip. But yes, it was very peaceful, and I had a great sense of freedom while I was doing it, and I suppose that's, you know, one of the nicest things you can feel.
Uh-huh. Now, what was interesting that I found, too, is because this is also a river that supplies food, lots of fishing and fishermen and so forth, is there was a person that you were describing in the book that was that you had noticed white powder in the river and fish floating belly up. What was that all about?
Yeah, well, you know, many developing countries don't have the sort of thought about the environment that we have and are gaining increasingly. You know, Egypt is a very poor country. There are people living on 10 cents a day there, and they live sort of subsistence living. And, you know, they need to get fish out of the river any way they can, and they find it in some places more expedient to just throw poison into the water and poison the fish.
Wow.
That was a bit shocking to me, and then I vowed not to eat fish anymore in Egypt.
I can believe you would. I remember reading that part thinking, okay, was there some sort of a factory on the river that they weren't monitoring? And I was like, no, they were doing this intentionally. And
well, I've heard of people fishing with dynamite in certain places. You know, dynamite that explodes underwater kills a lot of fish in one stroke, and then they get a net and they scoop them all up. But that's you know, that's a sign of a people who are really, they're borderline starving in some places in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It was just, it's just such an amazing journey to think about, just in its seeming quietude, but excitement and adventure at the same time. As you were saying, many people were kind of following you along, just sort of running along the banks and watching you, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I was kind of hoping that this might be a trip of reflection, but it seems to me that I'm going to actually have to be involved. You just can't get away with that.
Well, in the beginning, but it's not. The truth is the parts of the book where I was actually on the river rowing by myself with nobody asking me questions. River rowing is very hard to write about. It's very hard to make it interesting. It's like trying to write about a chess game, How many times can you say there were banana trees on the right and palm trees on the left, and the water was flowing, and I pulled the oars?
And then the white water and fish.
Yeah, the real interest is the people you meet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as it should be. That's for sure. I'll tell you now. What would you, if a person was interested in taking a trip like this, what steps would be necessary for them to consider before they do so?
Well, to take a trip alone on the Nile in a boat, you would have to be willing to do it a bit secretively, because it really, if I had made it known that I was doing this, people had said to me, you can ask permission from the government to do this, but they will never allow you. And if they, by some miracle, do allow you, they're going to make you pay a lot of money in fees, and they will insist on sending police in a boat behind you. And I knew I didn't want to do it that way. So the truth is, I actually did it illegally. Not that I don't think they would have put me in jail if they had discovered I was doing it, but I for anybody who may want to do a trip like that, you would have to do it very secretively and be prepared that if you get caught, you'd have a little bit of trouble.
Mm-hmm.
I think I managed
to change the adventure.
Yeah. Well, I managed. I mean, that was actually the thing that was a little bit nerve-wracking, was that I was doing it without permission. I think I managed to get away with it because I was only one person. I know that other foreign expeditions who have gone longer on the Nile, through several countries, have had trouble. As soon as they hit Egypt, they are not given permission. But they can't just sneak through, When you have more than one boat, you're very noticeable. And if the boat isn't a vernacular boat, if it's not an Egyptian boat, people will spot you right away. This was the reason I wanted to buy an Egyptian boat. I wanted to look as Egyptian as I possibly could.
Ah. Well, that certainly makes sense, too. Well, there you go, folks. It isn't something that you just go and you plan and you pack up the kids and you say, hey, let's go down the Nile. It's a lot more complicated than that, that's for sure. Any ideas on what your future trips are going to be? Well,
I am just about to go to India. I'm writing a new book about blindness, and I'm going to spend a lot of time at a school in India, a school for the blind in India. Mm-hmm. A couple of years ago, I went to Tibet to write a magazine article for Oprah magazine about a school for blind kids in Tibet, and I found it just fascinating. And so I'm hoping to do a book on the same subject.
Well, I'll tell you, it's really a marvelous book, especially as you talk about the people, the culture, especially the merging and blending, but yet the borders of the religions. You have the Muslims, the Christians, the Jews, even the Zionists, and you could just imagine how all of that coming together, you would think there would be sort of this volatile explosion, but as you said, you begin to understand that, hey, we're all human and we have the same curiosities regardless of our race or religion and our culture as well, and that each one of us has something to offer the other. And it's usually through that compassion and understanding that you'll be able to take interesting trips like this, even though they are illegal, so to speak, but do it right, do it with understanding and without arrogance. And I know that was one of the biggest problems that I had seen with Americans at times, and this was at a time that I was in France, and it happened to be a group of sailors, and they were walking around France as though French people had never seen an American before.
Right. Right.
And I'm thinking to myself, are you out of your mind? I mean,
Yeah.
why don't you just tone that down and show that humble respect that you really want to understand and know the culture, and you'll really find a lot of open hearts and hearths that will help you do that. And I think that if we could hear more of those messages here in America, that people wouldn't have this feeling that everybody out there is out to get us. And again, on our program consistently, I've heard the same message as the one you've told us today is, no, really, you'll be surprised that you'll actually reflect on the United States and think it seems more dangerous there than here in certain aspects.
Right.
And thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
You bet. And our guest today, Rosemary Mahoney, and her book is Down the Nile, Alone in a Fisherman's Skiff. And we want to thank you again for joining us on the program. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in today. Again, the book is Down the Nile, Alone in a Fisherman's Skiff, and our guest today, Rosemary Mahoney. Certainly not a trip that you can take alone, but if you do, just be sure that you do it without them knowing what's going on. That way you can enjoy yourself. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in today, and be sure that to sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter, just go ahead and go to our website, beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50, and right there, subscribe, and you'll find out about wonderful people such as Rosemary Mahoney and others, just to kind of shake up a little bit and let you realize that life is an adventure, so why grow old waiting for it? Go out there and grab it. Thank you for joining us again today, and remember, live your day past halfway.